Jimmy Greaves knew greatness because he had played beside it. Across Chelsea, Tottenham, West Ham, and England, he shared dressing rooms with some of British football's finest players. But his admiration was not always reserved for the biggest names. Terry Dyson was actually Greaves's favourite Spurs player, not because he was the most naturally gifted. Greaves admired his intelligence, effort, and ability to squeeze everything from his talent. Then there was Bill Brown. Greaves considered him a tremendous goalkeeper and one of the finest shot stoppers around. Stanley Matthews was different again. Greaves later mentioned Matthews when discussing the greatest footballers he had played with. They appeared together in Matthews's famous 1965 testimonial. Certain teammates received extraordinary praise for their courage, their intelligence, their ability, and sometimes for an understanding that seemed almost telepathic. Subscribe and help keep the stories of football's greatest generation alive. Because from here, we move through the teammates Greaves admired most, until we reach the one he spoke about in terms reserved for almost nobody else. When Jimmy Greaves arrived at Tottenham in December 1961, Danny Blanchflower was already far more than the club captain. To Greaves, he was the brain of the team. Blanchflower had captained Spurs to the historic league and FA Cup double only months earlier. But it was not simply trophies that impressed Greaves. It was the way Danny understood football. Greaves later called him a brilliant player, a brilliant captain, and a man with an extraordinary football mind. He remembered Blanchflower as one of the most knowledgeable and interesting people he had ever met. And Greaves saw that intelligence when pressure was at its highest. Before Tottenham faced Atletico Madrid in the 1963 European Cup Winners' Cup final, Bill Nicholson had warned his players repeatedly about the danger they faced. According to Greaves, Blanchflower eventually stood up and changed the mood. His message was simple. Tottenham were good enough to make Atletico worry about them. Spurs went out and won 5-1. Greaves scored twice. But his memories of Blanchflower went beyond one European night. In Greaves's description of that great Tottenham side, the distinction was revealing. Others supplied the power and aggression. Blanchflower supplied the thought. He controlled matches with intelligence rather than intimidation. For one of football's most instinctive goal scorers, that quality commanded enormous respect. Greaves could destroy a defence in a second. Blanchflower seemed to understand what would happen before that second ever arrived. Pat Jennings did not need anyone else to establish his greatness. But Jimmy Greaves gave him one of the strongest compliments a teammate could receive. Jennings arrived at Tottenham in 1964, still only 19. Greaves was already England's most feared goalscorer. He knew goalkeepers better than most. Their positioning, their reactions, their weaknesses, and what made the exceptional ones different. Years later, Greaves was asked a direct question. Who was the greatest player he had ever played with? He could not choose only one. But among all the legendary teammates from his career, Greaves immediately placed Jennings in a tiny group alongside Bobby Moore and Stanley Matthews. That was no ordinary compliment. Greaves had shared dressing rooms with some of the greatest footballers of his generation. Yet Jennings was one of the names that came to his mind when the question became simply, who was the greatest? They spent years together at Tottenham and celebrated the 1967 FA Cup triumph at Wembley. Jennings also remembered that Greaves treated him with encouragement when he was still establishing himself. Their respect clearly worked both ways. But Greaves's own verdict matters most here. He did not merely remember Jennings as a fine goalkeeper. When asked to think of the greatest footballers he had ever played beside, Pat Jennings was one of the men Jimmy Greaves chose. Before Jimmy Greaves found his most celebrated understanding at Tottenham, there was Bobby Smith. And Greaves never underestimated what Smith gave him. Smith was powerful, aggressive, a centre forward, prepared to battle defenders and goalkeepers in ways Greaves rarely needed to. Greaves later remembered Smith as a great goal scorer and spoke about the understanding they developed together. At times, he believed it became almost telepathic. Smith would occupy the centre halves. He would challenge for the difficult ball. He would create disorder around the penalty area. And Greaves could exploit what appeared around him. Their styles were completely different. That was precisely why they worked. Greaves later placed Smith among the very small number of players with whom he experienced that rare instinctive connection. No complicated instructions were required. One seemed to understand what the other was about to do, and the results were devastating. During their seasons together, Tottenham remained one of England's great attacking sides, with Smith and Greaves contributing heavily to that threat. But Greaves' admiration went beyond goals. He understood the value of the physical work Smith performed beside him. For a striker whose genius depended on finding space before defenders recognized the danger, Bobby Smith was one of those teammates who helped create it. With Bobby Moore, Jimmy Greaves' admiration went beyond football. When Greaves was asked to name the greatest players he had ever played alongside, Moore was one of the first names he gave, and his praise went even further. Greaves once described Moore as England's finest defender by 1,000,000 miles. He believed Moore possessed something rare. He was not brutally physical. He did not need to intimidate forwards. He read them. Moore seemed to know where the danger would appear before it arrived. Greaves understood exactly how difficult that was. They became England teammates and, later, briefly shared a dressing room at West Ham. But behind the football was genuine friendship. That became clear during the infamous 1970 incident in Colombia, when Moore was detained following an allegation that he had stolen a bracelet. Greaves was there covering England's World Cup preparations. He later recalled getting inside the place where Moore was being held, only to be thrown out. When Greaves returned, Moore confirmed that Jimmy was his friend, and he was allowed to see him. Greaves never believed the allegation. His loyalty to Moore was absolute. That is what separates this relationship from many others on Greaves' list. He admired Moore the footballer enormously, but he also trusted Moore the man. And when Greaves looked back at the finest players he had ever stood beside, Bobby Moore belonged among them for reasons that went far beyond what happened on the pitch. Jimmy Greaves admired plenty of great footballers, but his language about Dave Mackay was different. Greaves described him as the most complete professional footballer I have ever known, and that praise matters, because Greaves never saw Mackay simply as the fearsome, hard man remembered in photographs. He saw the complete player underneath it. Mackay could tackle, he could pass, he could read the game, he had strength, technique, and an extraordinary competitive instinct. Greaves remembered him as the heart of Tottenham, the man whose standards dragged more from everybody around him. Greaves recalled that Mackay made his teammates work harder simply to keep pace with him. And despite Mackay's intimidating reputation, Greaves remembered another side of him too. Away from football, they became close friends. That made Greaves' judgment more meaningful. He had seen Mackay in matches, in training, inside the dressing room, and away from the game. Years later, his verdict remained enormous. Greaves regarded Mackay as the greatest player ever to play for Tottenham. For a man who had shared that shirt with so many legends, and who became one himself, that was about as powerful an endorsement as Greaves could give. To Jimmy Greaves, Dave Mackay was not merely tough. He was the standard by which a complete footballer could be measured. Johnny Haynes earned a different kind of admiration from Jimmy Greaves. Greaves lived for movement. Haynes seemed to know where that movement would take him. They played together 19 times for England, and Greaves remembered Haynes as the creative force who could control a game with his passing. One performance stayed with him. England against Scotland at Wembley in 1961. England won 9-3. Greaves scored a hat-trick. But when he later remembered that extraordinary afternoon, he also remembered the man supplying the ammunition. Haynes could deliver the ball with remarkable precision. For Greaves, that was priceless. A goalscorer like him did not need several seconds. Sometimes he needed only one pass delivered at exactly the right moment. And Haynes understood that. Greaves later placed him among the tiny group of teammates with whom he developed an almost telepathic understanding. That word matters. Greaves had played alongside hundreds of footballers. Very few earned that description. With Haynes, he could begin the run knowing the pass might already be coming. There was little need for instruction, little need for explanation. The connection existed naturally. For perhaps the most instinctive goalscorer England ever produced, Johnny Haynes was one of those rare teammates who seemed capable of seeing the game at exactly the same speed. Then came the partnership, Jimmy Greaves described differently from almost every other. Alan Gilzean joined Tottenham in 1964, and something clicked almost immediately. Gilzean was intelligent, elegant, outstanding in the air. But what mattered most to Greaves was their understanding. Greaves said playing with Gilzean was almost like reading each other's minds. He knew where Gilzean would put the ball. Gilzean seemed to know where Greaves would move. No shout was necessary. no complicated instruction. They simply understood. Together they became known as the G-Men. But Greaves's admiration went far beyond a successful strike partnership. When asked which footballer he most enjoyed playing alongside, Greaves chose Gilzean. He called him a phenomenal player, and his greatest compliment went even further. Greaves described Gilzean as possibly the best footballer I've ever played with. Consider the company Greaves had known. World Cup winners, great captains, legendary goalkeepers, some of the finest footballers Britain ever produced. Yet Gilzean occupied a remarkable place in his memories. Others earned Greaves's respect. Some became close friends. But with Gilzean, football became almost wordless. Two players seeing the same possibility at the same moment. And perhaps that tells us why Greaves admired him so deeply. For one of football's greatest instinctive goal scorers, the perfect teammate was the man who understood his instincts before anybody else did. Subscribe and help keep the legends who built British football alive for the next generation.